At the beginning of any narcissistic dynamic, there is an unspoken agreement. One person seeks validation, and the other feeds on it. The narcissistic woman does not gain her power from cruelty alone. She gains it from emotional permission. She senses, often intuitively, when your sense of worth is entangled with her reactions. As long as your mood, confidence, or self-image rises and falls according to her approval, she remains psychologically elevated. This is why the first true shift in power never comes from confrontation, argument, or emotional outburst. It comes from withdrawal. Withdrawal here does not mean silence or avoidance. It means an inner decision that your value no longer requires external confirmation. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, no longer fragmented by unconscious dependence. When you withdraw emotional permission, you are not rejecting the other person. You are reclaiming the parts of yourself you outsourced to them. And this is deeply unsettling to a narcissistic personality. They are oriented toward control of emotional energy, not toward authentic connection. When that energy stops flowing, confusion follows. Notice what happens when your words no longer seek reassurance, defense, or recognition. Your language becomes simpler, slower, and more grounded. You stop explaining yourself. You stop asking to be understood. Instead, your words reflect a quiet self-containment. To the narcissistic psyche, this feels like standing before a locked door. There is no argument to win, no emotion to provoke, no insecurity to exploit. The fear does not come from what you say, but from what you no longer need to say. Psychologically, this is the moment when projection collapses. The narcissistic woman can no longer deposit her fears, doubts, or insecurities into you because you are no longer available as a vessel. Jung would say the shadow loses its host. And when the shadow has nowhere to go, it turns inward. This is why emotional independence is the most decisive word you ever speak, even if it is never spoken aloud. When you no longer ask for permission to be whole, control loses its meaning. And once control loses its meaning, the entire dynamic must change. Once emotional permission is withdrawn, a second shift becomes unavoidable. The way you carry yourself in conflict changes. Most people assume that strength is expressed through intensity, louder words, sharper arguments, stronger emotional displays. But in narcissistic dynamics, intensity is not power, it is currency. Anger, desperation, and passionate self-defense all signal investment. And wherever there is visible investment, there is something to manipulate. Calm detachment, on the other hand, is profoundly disorienting. When your tone remains even, when your words are measured rather than reactive, you communicate something far more threatening than anger, inner stability. Carl Jung understood that the unconscious responds not to what we claim, but to what we embody. A calm presence reveals that your center of gravity is internal. You are not fighting to regain balance because you never lost it. To a narcissistic woman, this signals that the usual levers no longer work. Notice how detachment alters the psychological field. You listen without rushing to correct. You respond without urgency. You pause without anxiety. These are not passive behaviors, they are signs of self-possession. Detachment does not mean indifference. It means you are no longer emotionally fused to the outcome. And narcissism depends on fusion. It needs the other person emotionally entangled, pulled into the drama, compelled to prove something. When you remain calm, the narcissistic strategy begins to fail. Provocation loses its reward. Escalation finds no echo. The interaction feels strangely hollow, as if the script has been forgotten. This is because calm detachment removes the mirror the narcissistic psyche relies on to feel significant. Without emotional reflection, the performance collapses. From a Jungian perspective, this is the ego refusing to be possessed by the complex. You are no longer seized by the emotional charge of the situation. Instead, you observe it. And what can be observed no longer dominates. The power shifts not because you overpower the other, but because you are no longer overpowered by your own reactions. This is the quiet authority that cannot be challenged, only recognized. When you learn to remain calm where you once reacted, you do not just change the conversation, you change the hierarchy. And the moment you stop feeding chaos with emotion is the moment your presence begins to speak louder than any words ever could. After calm detachment is established, a subtler but more decisive shift must occur, the way you speak truth. In narcissistic dynamics, truth is rarely debated openly. It is bent, reframed, denied, or turned back on you. Over time, this creates a quiet confusion, a sense that reality itself must be negotiated. And once you begin defending your perceptions, you have already surrendered psychological ground. The turning point comes when you learn to name reality without defending yourself. This does not mean accusing, lecturing, or explaining. It means stating what is, and allowing it to stand on its own. Carl Jung observed that neurosis often arises when a person betrays their own experience in order to preserve a relationship. When you stop betraying your perception, something profound happens. Your words regain weight.
Consider the difference between saying, "You're always doing this to me," and saying,
"This pattern keeps repeating." The first invites argument, the second closes it. One is emotional, the other is observational. Narcissistic personalities thrive in emotional fog because it allows them to reshape the story. Clear, grounded statements remove that fog. They do not seek agreement. They do not demand apology. They simply assert reality. This is deeply destabilizing to a narcissistic psyche because it removes the arena in which manipulation operates. If you are not trying to convince, you cannot be twisted. If you are not defending, you cannot be put on trial. Your words become boundaries rather than weapons. And boundaries, when calmly stated, are non-negotiable. From a Jungian lens, this is the ego aligning with truth rather than image. You are no longer performing a role for the relationship. You are speaking from an integrated center. The narcissistic woman senses this immediately. She may deny it, minimize it, or mock it, but these reactions reveal the impact. Reality, once named, cannot be unheard. The power of this approach lies in its restraint. You say less, but what you say lands deeper. You trust reality to do the work instead of your emotions. And when you stop arguing for your experience, you reclaim authority over it. This is the moment when truth stops being a defense and becomes a foundation. Speak clearly, stand still, and let reality speak with you. Once reality has been named without defense, a deeper test emerges, whether you will continue to participate in emotional games. Narcissistic dynamics are sustained not by single conflicts, but by repetitive cycles. Provocation, reaction, blame, reconciliation, and repetition. These cycles create the illusion of movement while keeping both people psychologically stuck. The game survives only if you keep playing your assigned role. Refusing to participate does not mean storming out or declaring victory. It is far quieter than that. It is the moment you recognize the pattern and choose not to enter it again. Jung spoke of the power of consciousness to interrupt unconscious repetition. When a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its grip. What once felt automatic now becomes optional. Emotionally, this is uncomfortable at first. The nervous system is accustomed to engagement, to tension, to resolution through drama. When you step out of the game, there is a strange emptiness, a silence where reaction used to be. To the narcissistic woman, this silence is unsettling. Her familiar strategies, provoking guilt, triggering anger, pulling you into explanation, no longer work. There is no hook to grab.
Your language changes here. You stop responding to bait. You decline circular arguments. You do not chase closure in moments designed to confuse you.
Instead of saying, "This isn't fair," you say nothing at all, or something simple and final. Not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. You recognize that not every invitation deserves an answer. From a Jungian perspective, this is the ego stepping out of the complex. The emotional charge that once possessed you is now observed rather than enacted, and what is not enacted begins to dissolve. The narcissistic game depends on emotional reciprocity. Without your participation, it collapses under its own weight. This refusal is often misinterpreted as coldness or indifference. In truth, it is maturity. You are no longer confusing intensity with intimacy. You are no longer mistaking engagement for connection. You understand that peace is not something negotiated within chaos, it is something chosen outside of it. The moment you stop playing the game, the rules lose their power. And when the rules lose their power, so does the player who relied on them. This is not an act of aggression, but of liberation. Step out of the pattern, and you step back into yourself. After you stop playing the game, something essential must take its place. Otherwise, the vacuum will pull you back into old patterns. That something is self-respect, expressed not as a demand, but as a lived reality. In narcissistic dynamics, self-respect is often eroded subtly. You begin compromising your values in small ways, accepting dismissiveness, tolerating inconsistency, rationalizing disrespect. Over time, language follows this erosion. You ask instead of state. You justify instead of choose. And without realizing it, your identity becomes negotiable. Reclaiming self-respect through language is the process of making your inner values audible. Carl Jung understood that speech is not merely communication, it is the articulation of the psyche. When your words align with your values, you signal integration. You are no longer split between what you tolerate and what you believe. This alignment is deeply destabilizing to a narcissistic woman because it removes ambiguity. She can no longer test how much you will bend without breaking, because you no longer bend at all. Notice how your words shift when self-respect returns. You no longer threaten, explain, or persuade. You state preferences. You define limits. You express what you will and will not accept, without hostility and without apology. These statements are not ultimatums, they are declarations of identity. And identity, once declared and lived, becomes non-negotiable. From a Jungian lens, this is the ego standing in service of the self. You are no longer acting to preserve attachment at the cost of integrity. You are acting to preserve integrity, even if attachment is lost. This is the moment narcissistic control weakens most visibly, not because you challenge authority, but because you no longer guarantee its relevance. There is often a reaction at this stage, dismissal, mockery, or sudden charm. These are attempts to pull you back into old roles. But self-respect, once embodied, is quiet and immovable. It does not argue. It does not chase understanding. It simply remains consistent. When your language reflects self-respect, your presence changes. You become harder to manipulate, not because you are guarded, but because you are whole. And wholeness cannot be controlled. This is the power of reclaiming your voice. You stop asking for permission to be treated well, and you start living as though it is already required. At the final stage of this psychological shift, something quiet but irreversible takes form: finality. Not spoken as a threat, not announced with drama, but felt unmistakably in your presence. Throughout narcissistic dynamics, access is assumed. Your attention, your empathy, your patience, these are treated as endlessly renewable resources. What changes everything is the moment this assumption dissolves. When access to you is no longer guaranteed, the entire structure of control destabilizes. Finality is not abandonment, it is psychological closure. Carl Jung understood that unresolved attachments keep the psyche bound to repetition. As long as a relationship remains psychologically open, it continues to exert influence, even in absence. Finality closes the loop. It is the inner decision that this dynamic no longer defines you, shapes you, or waits for resolution. You are complete without an explanation being accepted. This is why finality is so unsettling to a narcissistic woman. She does not fear loss in the emotional sense, she fears irrelevance. And your words imply, not declare, but imply, that your life is no longer oriented around her reactions. Something fundamental shifts. You stop negotiating the future. You stop revisiting the past. Your language reflects presence rather than hope or regret. You are no longer waiting for transformation, yours or hers. Notice how restrained this power is. You do not announce closure to provoke a response. You do not seek acknowledgement. Finality expresses itself through consistency, through the absence of re-entry points, through the calm certainty that what has ended is not under review. Jung would describe this as the ego withdrawing its projections and reclaiming psychic energy. The bond dissolves not through conflict but through completion. At this stage, even silence carries authority. Not the silence of punishment, but the silence of someone who has moved on internally. There is no hostility here, no desire to dominate, only the clarity that your inner world is no longer accessible to manipulation. This is the ultimate shift in power, when control is no longer resisted because it is no longer relevant. When your presence no longer seeks engagement, explanation, or closure from the other. And when you reach this point, the dynamic ends, whether the relationship continues or not. The most decisive words you ever speak are not spoken aloud. They are lived. And once you live them, the past loses its grip, and your future finally becomes your own.